Hi everyone, we're on the last section of microbial genetics. And again, I'm going to use a diagram that I put in your lecture study guide. This information is discussed in section 19.4 of your textbook, and there is some good information to read, but like I said, this just kind of makes it a little bit more compact, and I can tell the story with one diagram, which I think is helpful. So what I wanted to talk about is the concept of what we call antigenic drift and antigenic shift. Now, before we get into this, just think about those words. A drift or a shift. One of those is sudden and one of those is gradual. So even without studying this, you should be able to figure that out. And so you're thinking a drift or a shift. A shift sounds kind of dramatic, like a big jump from one thing to another. A drift happens gradually. And that's exactly the concept, this genetic change that I'm talking about. So let's start talking about an antigenic drift where genes are going to change gradually. Now, on that word antigenic, or an antigen is going to be a protein usually on the surface of a pathogen. And these are going to be the things that stimulate the immune system. So in this diagram, the antigens, this is a diagram of the influenza virus. And we're going to use the influenza virus for the example that we're going to use here. In fact, in this concept, we know the most about influenza viruses. So here's a diagram of an influenza virus. There's the viral genome. Remember that influenza virus is an RNA virus, so it's got some RNA molecules in there. We've got the capsid, and we've got some spikes on the outside. And so what the immune system is sensing is the differences in these spikes and making antibodies against these spikes when the host is infected. And so what happens with antigenic drift is a gradual accumulation of mutations. Every time that virus is copied inside of a cell, there's a chance a mutation is going to occur in the genome, and it's going to cause changes in these spike proteins. And they're showing you here that over time, I mean, you can imagine many people are infected with virus. You're probably getting millions and millions of virus particles out of an individual infected person. And you're eventually going to get changes in those proteins that are making up the spikes. So it's this minor antigenic change. And these are small changes, and but your immune system might gradually start losing its recognition of that virus. And so antigenic drift is happening all the time with influenza viruses. When you get infected with it, some of the virus that goes in might be different than the virus that goes out because of these changes. What can happen with antigenic drift is after a certain period of time, the dominant viruses that are circulating might actually look different and may no longer be protected by your immune system to this new virus. And that's why we end up having to get a new flu vaccine every year because of this antigenic drift. Some people might have resistance to this because a lot of times these viruses that are created by antigenic drift are viruses that have been around before. They're just new versions of old viruses. And so you might have had this, 10 years ago and still have some antibodies that can fight against it. We just don't know. So it's usually recommended that people get a flu vaccine every year because of this antigenic drift. It's kind of interesting, there's a big international process in deciding on flu vaccines. And for us in the United States, we look at what flu viruses are present in Asia in about a year ahead of time. And we start making vaccines against those and assume that those viruses are going to circulate around to us eventually. And as you know, with the flu vaccine, sometimes we get it right and sometimes we don't. But generally, it appears that getting a flu vaccine at least makes the illness less serious if you get vaccinated. But antigenic drift results in our seasonal flu epidemic. Why we have, once a year we get a period of time that people are more likely to get the flu because these new varieties are coming around. So it has epidemic potential. Lots of people will get it at a certain time. So we have flu season. Now there's something else that happens that's called antigenic shift. And again, we've documented this very well in influenza viruses. And so turns out you need 3 different organisms for an antigenic shift to happen. And for influenza viruses, these organisms are birds, pigs, and humans. And I'm just going to use this part down here. Typically what happens is there'll be an avian influenza. You've heard of avian influenzas in the news here and there. And periodically, it sounds like people are getting really worried because there's a very deadly avian influenza. And one of the big things is they're always trying to figure out, can this virus infect humans? And so this is something that public health organizations keep track of, because it turns out that pigs can often become infected with avian influenza viruses. Meanwhile, humans get the flu. We get infected with influenza viruses. And the thing about these is that they are able to infect humans very easily. Pigs can also frequently pick up human influenza viruses. So what can happen is pigs pick up these bird viruses that are very deadly, and they pick up these human viruses that are able to infect humans. Inside of that pig, sometimes these viruses can get mixed up, and they can exchange genetic material, and you can create brand new viruses that have never been seen by anybody before. And that's the antigenic shift. We've got a brand new virus. So it says a major antigenic change with pandemic potential. A pandemic is an epidemic that happens around the world. And what has to happen for that to happen is that it's a brand new virus, that nobody has immunity to it. With this antigenic drift, there's probably always going to be, because these are small changes, there's probably always going to be some people that have been exposed to this before. The antigenic shift is going to create a brand new virus that people can get exposed to and might have properties that have never been detected before. So when we hear about these pandemic flus, they actually don't occur seasonally. They happen suddenly at any time and can potentially be very deadly. They might be, like I said, something that we've never seen before, and they can be very contagious because so many people, or all people, have no immunity to it. Now, the one I can think of was in 2009. There was it was the H1N1 virus, and we were really worried about a pandemic. And the scientists were actually able to trace the origin of that virus to a particular farm in Mexico. It was a pig farm that also had birds, and they traced the virus found out which pig, where the pig farm was, and they found the first person that got this. There was a boy that lived on the farm that was the first one to get this new virus. Now, the concern was it was going to become a pandemic, and it could be a very dangerous virus and very contagious. But for whatever reason, that virus just petered out after a while. It didn't spread like our more recent pandemic did with COVID-19. The virus just lost its ability to infect. But the potential is always there. So antigenic drift versus antigenic shift, there can be really different consequences to these two phenomenon.